Hello, apes. This is the second part of Chapter 6, Population and Community Ecology. We're going to be looking at some species interactions that could affect species populations as well as community structure. So the first interaction that we look at here when we're talking about how it might impact population sizes is competition. So competition, the definition here is the struggle of individuals to obtain a limiting resource. So we know that the logistic growth curves are determined by those limiting resources, whatever they may be. So in this situation here, on the right, we've got two different species of bacteria. And in the top two graphs, they're growing separately. So this would be the normal population growth curve in a given environment if they're living by themselves. Put those two species together and you see that there's something very different that happens to that population. So obviously one of them is a dominant species and the other one is not. This goes into this concept of the competitive exclusion principle, which states that two species competing for the same limiting resources cannot coexist. So there's two different possibilities here. When we say cannot coexist, one of them being when two species are competing for the same resource, they'll either have a dominant species that pushes the other one out, which means they either move or they die, or you have two species that share, when they share those limiting resources, partition them out and divide up those resources so there's no longer sharing. They can still live in the same space, they're just not eating the same food anymore. So in this case, obviously P. aurelia is the dominant competitor and is essentially killing off P. caudatum. But this is the other scenario. So in this case, we've got two birds living together where one of them could possibly function on a smaller seed size, the other one could eat the larger seed size, and they overlap here in the middle. So with the competitive exclusion principle, the other possibility here is that one species does become dominant, but simply forces the other species to rely on other resources. So species 1 is kind of taking over that medium seed size and pushing species 2 or forcing species 2 to eat or rely on mostly those larger seed sizes. And as long as those seeds are in abundance, both of those species can coexist, just no longer with that overlapping niche. This concept is called resource partitioning. Another interaction here, which gets into those symbiotic relationships, is predation. There's actually different types of predation. One of them being the true predators that we know. They kill their prey. The other ones are herbivores and parasites. They're still consuming their prey, so they're still considered predators. Another relationship, a symbiotic relationship, is mutualism. This is where, and usually interspecific, so they're not the same species, interact with each other where both of them benefit. So in this case here, in these pictures below, we're looking at a coral, and that coral has a symbiotic algae living inside of it. This algae is super important for that coral because it does photosynthesis, produces food, and then provides those nutrients to the coral. Without that algae, that coral may not survive. So in the picture here on the right, you can see this brain coral and white patches. The white patches on that coral are where that algae has died or has been released from the coral, and so the coral has ended up dying. The algae then also benefit from that coral, this interaction with the coral, by providing a safe environment to live in. So the other relationship here, and the last type of symbiotic relationship, is commensalism. This is a type of relationship where one species benefits, but the other one is not really helped or harmed. There's nothing that benefits that species too. And here in this chart, it kind of lays out those different relationships and how they might benefit or be harmed by them. With competition, nobody benefits. Both of the species are harmed to a certain extent. With predation, one species is helped, the other one is obviously harmed, usually ultimately leading to their death. In mutualism, both species are benefiting, and then commensalism, only one is benefiting, the other is not harmed or helped. Okay, so how do these different relationships play a role in community structure? They can definitely affect population, which we've looked over some of those factors or those relationships that do. With a keystone species, it can change population sizes, but it has a greater impact than that. So keystone species are species that play a role in a community that has a much greater impact on that community than just their population. So here in this scenario, or this species on the left, we have a sea otter. And they're what we refer to as keystone predators. They're the ones that keep populations in check so that this community is a structured and balanced community. So here you have a sea otter eating sea urchins. That's their primary prey. And they do this because without those sea otters, the sea urchin populations will grow out of control and then consume a lot of those plants in that ecosystem, which unfortunately provides habitat for a lot of different species, as well as food for a lot of different species. So we actually see this scenario playing out along the coast of California, where the sea otter populations are declining and the sea urchin populations are increasing. Those community structures there have become very imbalanced, and there's a lot of concern as far as fisheries go and as far as the ecosystem's health along that coastline. So the other type of species is played out here on the picture to the right. This is obviously a beaver dam, and beavers would be considered ecosystem engineers. They're the ones that construct these different ecosystems that allow species to either move in or sustain the species that currently exist there. And this impacts mammals, this impacts insects, plant species, and a variety of different species that could increase that diversity as well as species richness in those ecosystems. They play such a pivotal role in developing and organizing and structuring different ecosystems that without them, they would just completely collapse. So how does community structure kind of change over time? These are some of the physical factors. We've talked about keystone species, which are kind of the biological factors that can control community structure. So these are ecological succession is really referring to those physical factors. And ecological succession is the known or predictable replacement of a group of species by another over time. So there's two different types of succession: terrestrial, which can either be primary or secondary succession, and then aquatic. So we'll look at the differences between primary and secondary succession first. You're going to need to know how that community starts and where it ends, and in order of that succession. So to start off with, we've got primary succession, and this is a community that develops really from nothing. You've got exposed rocks. That's it. There's no living organisms really to say much of. But over time, you have different species move in and establish themselves, like the lichen and moss. And these species that come in and establish themselves are known as pioneer species. They're the ones that first colonize that area. So to replace the lichen, we have weeds then. So after the lichen kind of break down that rock and they create soil, soil provides the environment for weeds to grow and then grasses to replace them, as well as shrubs. Then what we would call light-tolerant trees, because there's an abundance of light. And then at the end here, this climax forest, which is what we refer to it. Shade-tolerant trees are able to move in. They're the ones that don't mind growing underneath the canopy of these larger light-tolerant trees. So the thing that you need to remember from this is that primary succession is starting with bare rocks. In secondary succession, you're starting with soil that's been disturbed. So there's still soil here where plants and weeds are able to establish themselves or may already be established. But there's been some kind of disturbance that has wiped out that community. So secondary succession really follows the same sequence as primary succession, except again at the beginning it still has its soil. So a perfect example of secondary succession, at College Park a few years ago, a large tornado ripped through the campus. And there's actually still a path you can see where the tornado went through, because it ripped out all of those trees and churned up the soil in that area. So this is actually a really important process in nature where we're starting back at the beginning. And this allows a lot of species, new species, to come and move in and expand that species richness in the area. So more or different types of trees can come in and replace the ones that had already been there, to increase that biodiversity. Again, the important thing to remember, the difference between primary and secondary succession, is that with secondary succession, it's really a disturbance that causes this, and there's still soil there to grow from. With aquatic succession, over time, you'll see a change in going from what was aquatic to ultimately what could be a terrestrial ecosystem. So to start, you might have a lake, an open water lake, and over time this sediment builds up at the bottom of that lake. Soil kind of moves in, builds up, develops, and with that you have this community structure that changes where new plants are able to grow at the bottom of this ecosystem, or floating plants are able to move in because there's more light now. And then continuing over time, it just continues to fill up. The soil fills up, all of that water is completely replaced, usually by evaporation and water filtering through the soil, so it goes into the groundwater. And then you're left with this terrestrial ecosystem where grasses are able to come through and kind of establish themselves there. So we've talked about species richness and how some of these changes in community structure can affect species richness. So what are some factors that affect that biodiversity? So we know that latitude has a big impact. As we move from the equator, species richness tends to decrease the closer you get to either the North or South Pole. We know this because obviously the areas with the largest biodiversities tend to be around coral reefs, which also exists around the equator, and then also tropical rainforests. Time also plays a major factor in community structure and species richness. So this scenario in the book that they give, or the example that they give in the book, is Lake Baikal in Siberia. So this area is one of the oldest existing lakes in establishing itself about 25 million years ago. This is a unique place because it's got 580 different types of species of invertebrates. So by contrast, when we look at a different location like Great Slave Lake in northern Canada, which shares the same latitude, it has not been there nearly as long as Lake Baikal, and so only has about 4 species of invertebrates that exist within the lake. So time definitely plays a factor because there's more time for different species to establish themselves. And then the last one here is pretty obvious. Habitat size impacts the species richness. So obviously a larger habitat is going to hold or be able to hold more species within it. And there's a theory that goes along with this called the theory of island biogeography. So scientists studied some islands in Hungary and wanted to look at the relative size of those islands and then the abundance of species that exist there. And they noticed that, obviously by this graph, the larger the island, the more species, or the greater the species richness on those islands. So these are the different types of factors that might play into species richness and population, different interactions, and different changes, physical and biological, in community structures that could impact populations as well as biodiversity of communities. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in class next time. So hopefully I'll hear from some of you guys, and have a good one.